The gunshot echoing across the plains sent birds scattering from their perches as Lillian Matthews ducked behind the overturned wagon, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang. Wyoming Territory, 1876, was no place for a woman alone, but circumstances had forced her hand when the stagecoach was attacked just outside Rock Springs. The other passengers had fled, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the doctor's devastating diagnosis still ringing in her ears. "You there, behind the wagon," a deep voice called out. "I ain't looking to harm you. Those bandits are gone now." Lillian peered cautiously over the wooden slats, her wheat-colored hair falling loose from its pins. A tall figure approached on horseback, silhouetted against the setting sun. His wide-brimmed hat and the easy way he sat in the saddle marked him clearly as a cowboy. "How do I know you're not with them?" she called back, gripping the small derringer hidden in her skirts, the only protection her late father had insisted she carry. The rider slowed his approach, raising both hands to show they were empty. "Name's Mason Morgan, madam. I work the Circle M ranch just north of here. Saw the smoke from the road and came to investigate." His voice carried the honest, straightforward tone of a man who spent more time with cattle than people. "Looks like you could use some help." Lillian stepped cautiously from behind her shelter, assessing the stranger. His face was tanned from endless days under the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often. Nothing about him screamed danger, but the Wyoming Territory had taught her caution in the month since she'd arrived. "Lillian Matthews," she said finally. "The stage was headed for Rock Springs when those men attacked." Mason dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent his life on horseback. "You're in luck, Miss Matthews. Rock Springs is where I'm headed myself. My horse can carry us both if you don't mind riding double." Lillian hesitated. The alternative was staying alone as night fell on the open prairie. "That would be most appreciated, Mr. Morgan." As Mason helped her gather what little of her belongings had survived the attack, Lillian winced at a sharp pain in her side, a reminder of the fall she'd taken when the stagecoach was ambushed. "You're hurt," Mason observed, his brow furrowing with concern. "It's nothing," she replied quickly. Too quickly. The last thing she needed was another reminder of her physical vulnerabilities. The doctor in Chicago had been clear enough about those. "Just a bruise." Mason didn't press, but his eyes, green as spring grass, held a knowing look that suggested he didn't believe her entirely. "Let's get you to town, then. Doc Wilson can take a look if needed." The ride to Rock Springs was uncomfortably intimate, with Lillian seated in front of Mason, his arms around her to hold the reins. Despite her discomfort at being so close to a stranger, she found herself grateful for his solid presence as the landscape darkened around them. "What brings you to Wyoming Territory, Miss Matthews?" Mason asked as they rode, his breath warm against her ear in the cooling evening air. Lillian stared at the horizon, wondering how much to share. "A fresh start," she said finally. "My parents passed last winter and there was nothing left for me in Chicago." "I'm sorry for your loss," Mason replied, the simple words carrying genuine sympathy. "Wyoming's good for fresh starts. Plenty of open sky to clear a person's mind." "And you, Mr. Morgan, have you been in the territory long, going on 8 years now? Came west after the war with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back. Now I help run one of the biggest cattle operations in the county." There was quiet pride in his voice, the satisfaction of a man who had built something from nothing. Rock Springs came into view just as true darkness fell, its scattered lights a welcome sight after the emptiness of the prairie. Despite its small size, the town bustled with activity. Miners from the coal operation, cowboys from surrounding ranches, and the usual assortment of merchants and townspeople. Mason guided his horse to the modest hotel on the main street. Mrs. Abernathy runs a clean establishment, he explained as he helped Lillian dismount. Her legs wobbled slightly after the long ride, and his hand remained at her elbow to steady her. She's a widow, tough as nails but fair. Tell her Mason sent you, and she'll treat you right. Lillian looked up at him, suddenly reluctant to part ways with the only person she knew in this strange town. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features from merely handsome to something that made Lillian's heart skip a beat. Just doing what any decent man would, he said. I'll be in town for a few days on ranch business. If you need anything, you know where to find me. With a tip of his hat, Mason Morgan led his horse toward the livery, leaving Lillian standing before the hotel with her salvaged carpetbag, and an odd feeling that her fresh start had truly begun. The room Mrs. Abernathy showed her to was small but clean, with a narrow bed, washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. After washing the dust of travel from her face and hands, Lillian sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back to fall. The doctor's words in Chicago echoed in her mind. I'm afraid the scarlet fever left its mark, Miss Matthews. You'll never be able to bear children. At 22, Lillian had always assumed her future would include a husband and children. Now, that dream was as barren as she apparently was. What man would want a wife who couldn't give him sons and daughters to carry on his name? It was this reality, as much as her parents' deaths, that had driven her west. Perhaps in a new place, where no one knew her or her condition, she could find a different kind of life, one that didn't depend on the traditional expectations of womanhood. Morning brought renewed determination. Lillian dressed in her most presentable outfit, a navy blue traveling dress that had seen better days, but still maintained an air of respectability, and ventured downstairs to inquire about employment opportunities. Mrs. Abernathy, a stout woman with iron gray hair and quick, assessing eyes, looked Lillian up and down. Can you read and write? She asked bluntly. Yes, madam. I worked as a schoolteacher's assistant in Chicago. Well, you're in luck then. The town's been looking for a proper schoolteacher since Miss Henderson left to get married last spring. In the meantime, you can help me with the bookkeeping if you'd like room and board. I'm not as young as I used to be, and these ledgers strain my eyes something fierce. Gratitude washed over Lillian. That would be wonderful, Mrs. Abernathy. I'd be happy to help in any way I can. Good. The school board meets on Thursday evenings at the church. You can present yourself then if you're interested in the teaching position. Mrs. Abernathy paused, her expression softening slightly. Now, get yourself some breakfast. You're too thin by half. The hotel's small dining room was nearly empty when Lillian entered, most of the morning crowd having already departed for their day's work. She was halfway through a plate of eggs and biscuits when the door opened, admitting Mason Morgan along with a gust of cool morning air. His face brightened when he spotted her. Miss Matthews, glad to see you settling in. He crossed to her table, removing his hat as he approached. Mind if I join you? Lillian gestured to the chair across from her. Please do, Mr. Morgan, and thank you again for your assistance yesterday. Mason ordered coffee from the young girl serving tables, then turned his attention back to Lillian. How are you finding Rock Springs so far? Everyone has been very kind. Mrs. Abernathy has offered me work helping with the hotel accounts and mentioned the school needs a teacher. That would suit you, he said, studying her with those perceptive green eyes. You have a teacher's patience about you. Lillian felt a blush warming her cheeks at his assessment. "How would you know that, sir? We've barely met. The way you didn't panic yesterday, even with bandits on your trail, the careful way you listen before you speak." Mason's smile deepened the creases around his eyes. "A man learns to read people when his life might depend on it." "And what else do you read in me, Mr. Morgan?" The question slipped out before Lillian could reconsider its propriety. Mason leaned back slightly, regarding her with a thoughtful expression. "Someone running towards something, not just away. Am I right?" The accuracy of his perception startled her. "Perhaps a bit of both," she admitted. "Chicago held too many painful memories after my parents passed." Mason nodded, accepting her partial truth without pressing for more. "Well, Rock Springs has its share of hard-headed folks, but most are good people at heart. The kind who help neighbors through tough times without being asked. Like you did yesterday." His smile turned slightly self-deprecating. "Like I said, any decent man would have done the same." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside, raised voices and the sound of running feet. Mason was on his feet in an instant, moving to the window. His expression darkened. "What is it?" Lillian asked, rising to join him. "Trouble at the bank," he said grimly. "Stay here." Before she could respond, he was striding toward the door, settling his hat back on his head as he went. Through the window, Lillian watched as Mason crossed the street toward the small brick building that housed Rock Springs' only bank. A crowd had gathered, and at its center stood a man waving a pistol, his face contorted with rage. Despite Mason's warning, Lillian found herself moving toward the door, drawn by concern for the man who had so recently come to her aid. She stepped onto the boardwalk just in time to hear the angry man's shouts. "I worked that claim for 2 years. You can't foreclose when I'm this close to a strike." The bank manager, a thin man with nervous eyes, stood in the doorway. "Mr. Dawson, please. The terms of the loan were clear. We've extended your payments 3 times already. My wife and boy will be out on the street." Dawson's hand trembled as he raised the pistol higher, causing the crowd to step back. All except Mason Morgan, who continued forward with measured steps, his hands visible at his sides. "Tom," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed street. "This isn't the way." The desperate miner swung toward the new voice, his pistol following the movement. "Stay out of this, Morgan. Ain't your concern. Your boy Danny rode with us during spring roundup," Mason continued, as if they were simply having a conversation on a peaceful afternoon. "Good kid. Smart with horses. Be a shame if he had to visit his pa in jail instead of learning to run your claim." The mention of his son seemed to reach through Dawson's anger. The pistol lowered slightly. "What am I supposed to do? Everything I have is in that mine." "I might have a solution," Mason said, now close enough to speak in a normal tone. "Circle M needs good men for the fall drive. Pays well, and you can keep working your claim on the side until you hit that vein you're so sure is there." Dawson's expression wavered between hope and suspicion. "Why would you help me?" "Because that's what neighbors do," Mason replied simply. "And because I've been where you are, back against the wall with nowhere to turn. Someone gave me a chance once. I'm just passing it along." The tension seemed to drain from Dawson's body. He lowered the gun completely, looking suddenly older and very tired. "I can't lose everything, Mason." "You won't," Mason assured him, stepping forward to gently take the weapon. "Let's talk to Mr. Peterson here about a new payment arrangement while you're working at the ranch." The bank manager, clearly relieved at the peaceful resolution, nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. Perhaps we can work something out." As the 3 men moved into the bank, the crowd began to disperse, the excitement of the morning giving way to the normal rhythm of the day. Lillian remained on the boardwalk, watching through the bank's large front window as Mason spoke earnestly to both men, his manner calm and authoritative. "That's Mason Morgan for you," Mrs. Abernathy said, appearing at Lillian's side. "Always stepping in when there's trouble, always finding a middle path." "He seems to command a great deal of respect," Lillian observed. "Earned it the hard way," the older woman replied. "Came here with nothing after losing his family's Texas ranch in the war. Built himself up working other men's cattle until he could partner with old man McAllister on the Circle M." Mrs. Abernathy gave Lillian a sidelong glance. "Not married, either, though half the unmarried women in the county have set their caps for him." Lillian felt her cheeks warm at the implication. "I've only just arrived in town, Mrs. Abernathy. I'm hardly setting my cap for anyone." The older woman's knowing smile suggested she didn't entirely believe this protest. "Of course, dear. Now, shall we look at those ledgers?" The morning's not getting any younger. For the next few days, Lillian settled into a routine at the hotel, helping Mrs. Abernathy with the accounts in the mornings and exploring the small town in the afternoons. She saw Mason Morgan occasionally, usually from a distance as he conducted his business around town. Each time their paths crossed, he greeted her with the same warm smile and inquired after her comfort, but never pressed for more than casual conversation. On Thursday evening, Lillian presented herself to the school board, a collection of the town's leading citizens who met in the small church at the end of the main street. She answered their questions about her educational background and teaching philosophy, grateful for the years she'd spent assisting in Chicago's classrooms. "We can only offer $15 a month," explained Samuel Wilson, the town doctor who served as the board's chairman. "Plus lodging in the small house behind the schoolhouse. It's not much, but it sounds perfectly adequate," Lillian interrupted, smiling. "When would you like me to start?" The relief on the board members' faces was palpable. "Monday morning," Doc Wilson said. "The children have been running wild all summer. It's high time they got back to their studies." As Lillian left the church, pleased with her new position, she was surprised to find Mason Morgan waiting outside, leaning against one of the porch posts. "Congratulations, schoolteacher," he said, straightening as she approached. Lillian raised an eyebrow. "News travels fast." "Small town," he replied with a shrug. "I was at the Mercantile when Mrs. Wilson came in to tell her husband that the board would be meeting a promising candidate tonight." He fell into step beside her as she headed back toward the hotel. "Thought I might walk you back, if you don't mind the company." The evening was pleasant, with a cool breeze tempering the lingering heat of the day. Stars were beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky, and oil lamps cast golden pools of light from the windows of homes and businesses along the street. "I understand I have you to thank for this position, in a roundabout way," Lillian said as they walked. At Mason's questioning look, she continued, "If you hadn't rescued me from the prairie, I wouldn't be here at all." Mason chuckled. "Hardly a rescue, but I'm glad it worked out well for you." He paused, his expression turning more serious. "Rock Springs needs good people, especially those willing to invest in the next generation." "You have children, Mr. Morgan?" The question escaped before Lillian could consider its propriety. If Mason was offended by the personal inquiry, he didn't show it. "No, madam. Never found the right woman to start a family with." Something in his tone suggested there was more to that story, but he didn't elaborate. "My ranch hand's children are the closest I've come to having my own. They all call me Uncle Mason, which suits me fine." They walked in companionable silence for a few moments before Mason spoke again. "There's a social at the Grange Hall this Saturday. Dancing, food, the usual country entertainments. Would you consider attending as my guest?" Might be a good way to meet more of the townspeople before you start teaching their children. Lillian considered the invitation, aware of a fluttering sensation in her stomach that had nothing to do with nervousness about meeting new people. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Morgan." "Mason, please," he said, his smile visible even in the gathering darkness. "If we're to be friends, we should dispense with formalities." "Lillian, then," she replied, returning his smile. They had reached the hotel and Mason tipped his hat in farewell. "I'll call for you at 7 on Saturday." "Good night, Lillian." "Good night, Mason." As Lillian watched him walk away, she felt a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Mason Morgan was unlike any man she'd met before, straightforward yet perceptive, confident without arrogance. In other circumstances, she might have allowed herself to dream of what could develop between them. But her condition cast a shadow over any such thoughts. What man would want a barren wife, especially here in the West, where children were not just desired but often necessary for a family's survival? Saturday arrived bright and clear, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the approaching fall. Lillian spent more time than usual preparing for the social, washing her hair with the precious lavender-scented soap she'd brought from Chicago and pressing her best dress, a dark green wool that brought out the amber flecks in her brown eyes. Mrs. Abernathy watched these preparations with undisguised interest. "Mason Morgan doesn't escort just anyone to town gatherings," she observed as Lillian arranged her hair. "He's particular about his company." "We're merely friends," Lillian insisted, though the fluttering in her stomach whenever she thought of him suggested her feelings might run deeper than friendship. "He's being kind to a newcomer, nothing more." The older woman made a non-committal sound. "If you say so, dear." "Still, that green brings out your eyes beautifully. Shame to waste it on merely friends." At precisely 7 o'clock, a knock at the hotel's front door announced Mason's arrival. Lillian descended the stairs to find him waiting in the small lobby, dressed in a clean white shirt with a string tie, dark trousers, and a vest that emphasized his broad shoulders. His customary hat was in his hands, and his dark hair was neatly combed. The appreciation in his eyes as he took in her appearance brought a warmth to Lillian's cheeks. "You look lovely," he said simply. "Thank you. You're quite presentable yourself," she replied, attempting to match his direct manner. Mason offered his arm and they stepped out into the evening air. The Grange Hall was at the opposite end of town from the hotel, and as they walked, Mason greeted nearly everyone they passed by name. "Does everyone in Rock Springs know you?" Lillian asked, amused by the constant stream of acknowledgments. "Pretty much," he admitted with a rueful smile. "Hazard of doing business with most of the county at one time or another. Cattle ranching touches everything out here from the merchants who supply us to the railroad that ships our beef east." The Grange Hall was already lively when they arrived, with fiddle music spilling out the open doors and lanterns illuminating the yard, where some of the town's older residents had set up chairs to watch the proceedings. Inside, tables laden with food lined one wall, while the center of the hall had been cleared for dancing. Mason introduced Lillian to a dizzying number of people: the blacksmith and his wife, the telegraph operator, ranchers from neighboring spreads, and countless others whose names and faces blurred together. Everyone seemed genuinely welcoming, though Lillian noticed several young women regarding her with speculative or even envious glances. "Would you care to dance?" Mason asked as the musicians struck up a lively reel. Lillian hesitated. "It's been some time since I've attempted anything more complicated than a waltz." "Then we'll start with something simple," he said, leading her toward the dance floor. "Just follow my lead." The dance was indeed straightforward, with couples forming two lines that moved together and apart in a pattern Lillian quickly grasped. Mason was an excellent partner, his hand firm at her waist as he guided her through the steps. When the music ended, they were both slightly breathless and smiling. "Not bad for a city girl," Mason teased as they moved to the side to allow other couples space. "I'm a quick study," Lillian replied, enjoying the easy rapport between them. They danced several more sets before taking a break for refreshments. Mason fetched them each a cup of punch, and they found a relatively quiet corner where they could observe the festivities. "So, schoolteacher," Mason said, his eyes twinkling with good humor, "are you ready to tame Rock Springs' wild youth?" "I hope so," Lillian replied, suddenly aware of the responsibility she'd undertaken. "How many students should I expect?" "About 20, ranging from 6 to 16. Most are good kids, but a few might test your limits." Mason's expression grew more serious. "Teaching out here isn't like in the East. These children need practical knowledge as much as book learning. They might miss school during planting and harvest, or when their families need help with cattle." Lillian nodded, appreciating his insight. "In Chicago, I worked with children from many different circumstances. I learned that flexibility is often more important than rigid adherence to curriculum." "You'll do well then," Mason said with approval. He was about to say more when a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A man Lillian recognized as Tom Dawson, the minor Mason had prevented from shooting the banker, had entered with his family. A boy of about 12 stood close to his father, while a thin woman who must be Mrs. Dawson held the hand of a younger child. "Excuse me a moment," Mason said, setting down his cup. "I promised Tom I'd speak with him about starting work at the ranch." As Mason crossed the room to greet the Dawson family, Lillian watched the interaction with interest. He clapped Tom on the shoulder like an old friend, then crouched to speak to the boy at eye level, eliciting a shy smile. When he rose, he said something to Mrs. Dawson that made her laugh, the first genuine happiness Lillian had seen on the woman's weary face. "He has a way with people, doesn't he?" Lillian turned to find a handsome older woman standing beside her, gray streaking her dark hair and fine lines surrounding her kind eyes. "Yes, he does," Lillian agreed. "I'm Lillian Matthews, by the way. I'll be starting as the schoolteacher on Monday." "Margaret McAllister," the woman introduced herself. "My husband James and Mason are partners in the Circle M Ranch, and you're the young lady Mason rescued from bandits, aren't you? He told us about finding you when he came by for dinner last week." "He exaggerates my predicament," Lillian said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks again. "But yes, he was kind enough to help me reach town safely." Margaret studied Lillian with keen interest. "Mason doesn't exaggerate much of anything in my experience. He's one of the most straightforward men I've ever met." She smiled, the expression warming her entire face. "He also doesn't typically bring guests to these gatherings. You must have made quite an impression." Before Lillian could formulate a response, Mason returned, greeting Margaret with obvious affection. "I see you've met my partner's better half," he said to Lillian. "Margaret keeps both James and me in line when we get too caught up in ranch business." "Someone has to remind you both that there's more to life than cattle," Margaret replied good-naturedly. "Speaking of which, James and I would love to have you both for Sunday dinner tomorrow after church. What do you say, Miss Matthews? Ready to see what ranch life looks like up close?" The invitation took Lillian by surprise. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose—" "Nonsense," Margaret interrupted. "Any friend of Mason's is welcome at our table. Besides, I've been dying to meet the woman brave enough to take on our town's educational needs." Mason's expression was hopeful as he looked at Lillian. "The Circle M is worth seeing if you're interested, and Margaret sets a table that would put city restaurants to shame. How could she refuse when both were being so welcoming? Then I accept with pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. Margaret seemed delighted. Wonderful. We'll expect you both after services. With a meaningful glance at Mason that Lillian couldn't quite interpret, she excused herself to rejoin her husband across the room. I hope you don't mind, Mason said once they were alone again. The McAllisters are like family to me. I think Margaret's been wanting to size you up ever since I mentioned helping you. Size me up, Lillian repeated, arching an eyebrow. Mason looked slightly abashed. Poor choice of words. She's protective of the people she cares about, that's all. The music changed to a waltz and Mason's expression brightened. Now this is one dance you said you know, he said, offering his hand. Shall we? The rest of the evening passed in a pleasant blur of dancing, conversation, and laughter. By the time Mason walked Lillian back to the hotel, the moon was high overhead, casting silver light on the quiet streets. I enjoyed this evening very much, Lillian said as they reached the hotel's entrance. Thank you for inviting me. The pleasure was mine, Mason replied, his voice low in the stillness. He hesitated, then added, I'll come by tomorrow at 10 to escort you to church if that suits you. Yes, that would be lovely. There was another moment of hesitation, a charged silence that made Lillian acutely aware of his nearness. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her, but then Mason stepped back slightly, returning to the safety of formality. Good night then, Lillian. Sleep well. Good night, Mason. As she prepared for bed, Lillian found her thoughts continually returning to the tall cowboy with the kind eyes and steady presence. Despite her best intentions to guard her heart, she was developing feelings for Mason Morgan, feelings that could only lead to disappointment when he inevitably learned of her condition. Sunday morning dawned clear and warm, with the promise of heat later in the day. Lillian dressed in her Sunday best, a pale blue dress with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, and was ready when Mason arrived to escort her to the small white church at the end of the main street. The service was simpler than what Lillian was accustomed to in Chicago, but the minister's sermon on community and mutual support resonated deeply. She noticed how Mason listened attentively, occasionally nodding in agreement with particularly salient points. After the service, they joined the McAllisters for the drive to the Circle M Ranch. James McAllister proved to be as welcoming as his wife, a hearty man with a booming laugh, who insisted Lillian call him James rather than Mr. McAllister. The ranch itself took Lillian's breath away. Nestled in a valley with mountains rising in the distance, the main house was a substantial two-story structure of timber and stone, with outbuildings arranged nearby in a practical pattern. Corrals held horses of various colors, and in the distance, cattle grazed on rolling grasslands. It's beautiful, Lillian said as Mason helped her down from the wagon. Home, he replied simply, but the pride in his voice was unmistakable. Margaret insisted on giving Lillian a tour of the house while the men checked on a new foal that had been born the previous day. The interior was comfortable rather than ostentatious, with solid furniture and colorful quilts that made the spaces feel welcoming. James and I never had children of our own, Margaret explained as they moved through the rooms. It's one of my great regrets in life. The casual mention of childlessness made Lillian's heart skip a beat. I'm sorry, she said carefully. Margaret's smile held a trace of old sadness. Life doesn't always give us what we expect, does it? But it often provides what we need if we're open to seeing it. She paused at a window that overlooked the yard, where Mason and James were visible, deep in conversation. When Mason came to work for us 8 years ago, he was like the son we never had. Now he's James's full partner and more family than employee. Lillian absorbed this information, struck by the echoes of her own situation. You built a different kind of family, she observed. Exactly so, Margaret said, giving Lillian an appraising look. Blood isn't the only thing that makes a family, Miss Matthews. Sometimes the families we choose are stronger than those we're born into. The conversation shifted to other topics as they continued the tour, but Margaret's words lingered in Lillian's mind. She had never considered that there might be different ways to define family. Having always assumed the traditional path of marriage and children was the only true fulfillment for a woman. Dinner was a joyous affair, with hearty food and lively conversation. James regaled them with stories of the early days of ranching in Wyoming, while Margaret gently teased both men about their single-minded dedication to the cattle business. If it weren't for Margaret, Mason explained to Lillian, we'd probably live in the bunkhouse with the ranch hands and eat beans straight from the can. Absolutely not, James protested with mock indignation. We'd at least warm the beans first. The easy camaraderie between them made Lillian feel included rather than an outsider, and she found herself laughing more than she had in months. After the meal, Mason suggested showing Lillian the rest of the property. There's a nice view from the ridge behind the house, he said. If you're not too tired from yesterday's dancing. I'd love to see it, Lillian replied, eager for a few moments alone with him. They walked in companionable silence, following a well-worn path that wound up a gentle slope. Mason occasionally pointed out features of the ranch, the creek that provided water year-round, the sheltered pastures where they kept pregnant cows in winter, the distant line of trees that marked the boundary with the next property. When they reached the top of the ridge, Lillian gasped softly. The view was spectacular, rolling plains stretching to distant mountains, with the ranch buildings nestled below like toys. The afternoon sun bathed everything in golden light, making the scene appear almost like a painting. This is my favorite spot on the entire ranch, Mason said, standing close beside her. Whenever I have a difficult decision to make, I come up here to think. I can see why, Lillian replied. It puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Our problems seem smaller when viewed against all this. Mason studied her face with that perceptive gaze that seemed to see more than she intended to reveal. What problems are you trying to put in perspective, Lillian? The directness of the question caught her off guard. She looked away, focusing on the distant mountains. Everyone has their burdens to bear. True enough, he agreed, not pushing for details she wasn't ready to share. But some burdens are lighter when shared. They stood in silence for a while, the only sounds the whisper of the wind through the grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Finally, Mason spoke again, his voice thoughtful. I lost my family's ranch in Texas during the war. Everything my father and grandfather had built, gone in an instant because we were on the losing side. There was old pain in his voice, but no bitterness. Came north with nothing but determination and the skills my father taught me. James gave me a chance when no one else would. Hired me as a common ranch hand, then foreman, then partner. He saw something in you worth investing in, Lillian said softly. Mason nodded. He and Margaret showed me that family isn't just about blood. It's about who stands by you when times are hard. He turned to face her fully. I've noticed something similar about you, Lillian. You understand that connection goes deeper than circumstance. The perception in his words startled her. How could you possibly know that about me? The way you interact with people, he explained. At the social last night, you listened to old Mrs. Timmons' stories like they were the most interesting things you'd ever heard. You knelt down to speak to the Dawson boy at his level, made him feel important instead of invisible. A smile touched his lips. You see people, Lillian, really see them. That's rare. Warmth bloomed in Lillian's chest at his words. No one had ever described her that way before, and the fact that he had noticed such details made her feel truly seen in return. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to articulate the complexity of emotions his observation stirred in her. They began the walk back to the house as the afternoon light started to fade. Near the bottom of the path, Mason stopped and turned to Lillian, his expression suddenly serious. "Would you allow me to call on you properly? Not just as a friend showing a newcomer around town, but with intention." The question she had both hoped for and dreaded hung in the air between them. Lillian's heart raced as she considered her response. To accept would be to open herself to the possibility of deeper hurt when he inevitably learned of her condition. To refuse would be to deny the connection she felt growing between them. "Mason," she began carefully, "there are things about me you don't know." "I expect there are," he replied, his gaze steady. "Just as there are things about me you've yet to discover." That's the nature of getting to know someone, isn't it? His reasonableness made her hesitation seem foolish, yet the fear remained. What if those things change your mind? Mason considered this, his expression thoughtful. "I'm not a man who changes course easily once I've set my direction," he said finally. "But I understand your caution. Take whatever time you need to decide. My interest won't wane in the meantime." The ride back to town was pleasant, with conversation flowing easily between all four occupants of the wagon. When they reached the hotel, Mason helped Lillian down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I'll see you soon," he promised, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Good luck with your first day of teaching tomorrow." "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy under the knowing gazes of the McAllisters. "And thank you both for your hospitality," she added, addressing James and Margaret. "I had a wonderful time." "You're welcome at the Circle M anytime," Margaret assured her with a warm smile that suggested she saw more between Lillian and Mason than either had openly acknowledged. That night, Lillian lay awake long after retiring, her mind replaying the events of the weekend. Mason's request to court her formally had been both thrilling and terrifying. Could she allow herself to hope for something she had thought forever beyond her reach? Or would revealing her secret only lead to heartbreak for them both? The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building with rows of wooden desks facing a larger teacher's desk and blackboard. Lillian arrived early on Monday morning, wanting time to organize her thoughts and materials before the students arrived. She had just finished writing the day's lessons on the blackboard when the door opened, admitting a stream of children of various ages. They regarded her with a mixture of curiosity, wariness, and in some cases, outright mischief. "Good morning," Lillian said, smiling as they found their seats. "I'm Miss Matthews, your new teacher. I'm looking forward to getting to know each of you." The morning passed in a blur of introductions, assessments of the students' current knowledge, and establishing expectations for behavior and studies. Most of the children were respectful, if somewhat reserved with the new teacher, though a few of the older boys tested boundaries in ways Lillian had anticipated. By the time the lunch break arrived, Lillian had a better sense of the challenges ahead. The older students had received inconsistent education, with gaps in their knowledge that would need addressing. The younger ones were eager but easily distracted. All of them, however, showed a practical intelligence that impressed her. They might not know their multiplication tables perfectly, but they could calculate how many fence posts would be needed for a specified length of fencing without difficulty. As the children scattered to eat their packed lunches in the schoolyard, Lillian noticed a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Mason dismounted near the schoolhouse steps, tipping his hat as he approached. "Thought I'd check in and see how your first morning was going," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners in that now familiar smile. "Busy," Lillian replied honestly, "but good. They're bright children, even if their formal education has been somewhat irregular." Mason leaned against the doorframe, watching the children play in the yard. Most of them learn as much from life as from books out here. Billy Thompson, there can track game better than most grown men, and Sarah Wilson has been helping her father with patience since she was 8. Lillian followed his gaze to a serious-looking girl of about 12 who was reading beneath a tree instead of playing with the others. "The doctor's daughter, that's her. Bright as they come, wants to be a doctor herself someday from what I hear." Something in his tone made Lillian look at him more closely. "You don't sound like you disapprove of that ambition." "Why would I?" Mason asked, seeming genuinely puzzled. "The West needs good doctors, regardless of whether they are men or women. My mother was the best healer in our county back in Texas. Never had formal training, but she knew more about herbs and setting bones than any physician who passed through." His casual acceptance of a girl's unconventional ambition touched something in Lillian. Perhaps Mason Morgan was even more unusual than she had realized. "I brought you something," he said, reaching into his saddlebag. He produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "A welcome gift for the new schoolteacher." Lillian unwrapped it to find a beautiful leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with a simple but elegant pattern of wildflowers. "Mason, it's lovely," she said, running her fingers over the soft leather. "Thought you might want to record your observations about your students or just your experiences in a new place," he explained, looking pleased at her reaction. "The binding was done by Mr. Townsend at the saddle shop. He's quite the craftsman." The thoughtfulness of the gift moved Lillian deeply. "Thank you. I'll treasure it." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Mason spoke again. "I was wondering if you might join me for supper at the hotel dining room tonight to celebrate your first day of teaching." "I'd like that," Lillian replied, feeling a flutter of anticipation at the prospect of spending more time with him. Mason's smile widened. "Good. I'll come by around 6 if that suits you." The rest of the school day passed quickly, with Lillian dividing her attention between groups of students working at different levels. By the time she dismissed the class, she was tired but satisfied with the progress they had made. She returned to the hotel with just enough time to freshen up before Mason arrived. Mrs. Abernathy watched with undisguised interest as Lillian came downstairs to meet him. "2 evenings in a row," the older woman observed. "People will talk, you know." Lillian felt a blush warming her cheeks. "We're just friends, Mrs. Abernathy." "If you say so, dear," the hotel keeper replied with the same skepticism she'd expressed before. "Though I've never seen Mason Morgan look at a just friend the way he looks at you." Dinner was pleasant, with Mason asking detailed questions about Lillian's first day of teaching and sharing stories about some of the students from his perspective as a rancher who knew their families. His genuine interest in her work and the children's welfare touched Lillian deeply. As they lingered over coffee, Mason's expression grew more serious. "Have you thought any more about my question yesterday?" Lillian knew immediately what he was referring to. "Yes," she admitted, meeting his gaze directly, "but I'm still uncertain, Mason. There are complications in my life that you don't understand." "Then help me understand," he said simply. She looked down at her cup, gathering her courage. This moment had been inevitable from the first time she'd felt that spark of connection with him. "Not here," she said finally. "Would you walk with me? I think this conversation requires more privacy than the hotel dining room affords." Mason immediately stood, leaving enough money on the table to cover their meal and a generous tip. They walked in silence through the quiet evening streets, eventually finding themselves at the small town park where a few benches offered places to sit beneath old cottonwood trees. Once they were seated, Lillian took a deep breath, steeling herself for what must be said. "Before I came to Wyoming, I was ill with scarlet fever," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "The illness was severe, and afterward, the doctor told me that I would never be able to have children." She couldn't bring herself to look at Mason as the words hung in the air between them. "I understand if this changes things," she continued quickly. "A man in your position would naturally want heirs for all you've built. I just thought you should know before feelings develop further." The silence that followed seemed interminable. When Mason finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "Lillian, look at me." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to his face, expecting to see disappointment or, worse, pity. Instead, his expression held only warmth and understanding. "There are many ways to build a family," he said, the simple statement carrying profound meaning in the context of what she had just revealed. "Children born to us is only one possibility." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes at the unexpected response. "Most men would consider it a deal-breaker," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Especially here, where children are needed to help work the land." Mason reached out, taking her hand in his. "I'm not most men," he said, a hint of his usual humor returning. "And while I won't pretend I never thought about having children of my own, it's not the only future I can imagine." He looked out across the darkening park, his expression thoughtful. "The Circle M employs nearly 20 men year-round, more during the busy seasons. Most have families. Their children already call me Uncle Mason and come to me with their problems and triumphs. The Dawson boy, Danny, has been following me around like a shadow whenever his father brings him to the ranch." Mason's gaze returned to Lillian's face. "What I'm trying to say, perhaps not very eloquently, is that there are children who need love and guidance even if they don't share our blood. And if that's not enough, there are always orphans who need homes." Hope, fragile but persistent, bloomed in Lillian's heart. "You've thought about this before," she realized. "Not specifically," he admitted. "But I've lived long enough to know that life rarely follows the exact path we imagine for ourselves. The question is whether we can find happiness in the path that opens before us, even if it's not the one we originally chose." A tear slipped down Lillian's cheek, and Mason gently brushed it away with his thumb. "I'm not asking for any decisions tonight," he said softly. "Just the chance to continue getting to know you, to see where this connection between us might lead." Lillian took a shaky breath, overwhelmed by his understanding. "Yes," she whispered. "I'd like that very much." The smile that lit Mason's face made her heart skip a beat. "Good," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "Now may I walk you back to the hotel? It's getting late, and you have eager young minds to shape in the morning." As they walked back toward the hotel, Mason kept hold of Lillian's hand, his grip warm and reassuring in the cool evening air. The weight that had pressed on her heart since the doctor's diagnosis in Chicago felt lighter than it had in months, not entirely lifted but no longer crushing her beneath its burden. At the hotel entrance, Mason paused, still holding her hand. "Thank you for trusting me with your truth," he said, his voice low and sincere. "It can't have been easy." "Easier than I expected," Lillian admitted. "You have a way of making difficult conversations feel safer." Mason's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "A useful skill when negotiating with stubborn cattlemen." He hesitated, then leaned forward slowly, giving her ample time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Good night, Lillian. Sleep well." "Good night, Mason." As autumn progressed, Lillian settled into the rhythm of life in Rock Springs. Her days were filled with teaching, and her evenings increasingly included Mason's company. They often ate dinner together at the hotel, sometimes joined by the McAllisters or other townsfolk who had become Lillian's friends. On weekends, Mason would take her riding in the countryside surrounding the town, showing her hidden valleys and spectacular vistas that few visitors ever saw. Their relationship developed gradually, with a naturalness that felt both comfortable and exciting. Mason never pressed for more than Lillian was ready to give, seeming content to let their connection deepen at its own pace. The first time he kissed her properly on a crisp October afternoon, as they watched the sunset from the ridge at the Circle M, it felt like the most natural progression in the world. As Thanksgiving approached, the school organized a small pageant to commemorate the holiday. The children were excited about performing for their parents, and Lillian found herself working long hours to help them prepare their recitations and songs. The evening of the pageant, the schoolhouse was packed with families eager to see their children perform. Lillian stood at the back, watching proudly as her students demonstrated what they had learned. Even the most reluctant scholars had found some aspect of the program to excel in, whether it was reciting historical facts about the holiday or singing in the small choir. Mason slipped in beside her partway through the performance, having come directly from the ranch. "Sorry I'm late," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Had a situation with a cow in labor." "Everything all right?" Lillian asked, concerned. "Fine now. Healthy calf, happy mother." His pride in this everyday miracle of ranch life was evident. And not for the first time, Lillian was struck by his deep connection to the natural cycles of birth, growth, and renewal that were integral to his world. After the pageant, as parents collected their children and offered congratulations on a successful performance, Mason drew Lillian aside. "I've been thinking," he said, an unusual nervousness in his manner. "Christmas is coming up, and I was wondering if you might consider spending it at the Circle M. Margaret always puts together a big dinner for the Hands and their families. It would mean a lot to me if you were there." The invitation touched Lillian deeply. Christmas had always been a family holiday, and this would be her first without her parents. The prospect of spending it alone had been weighing on her mind. "I'd love to," she said, feeling a rush of warmth at the pleasure that lit Mason's face. "Good," he replied, squeezing her hand. "There's something else I wanted to ask you, but not here. Are you free to go riding with me on Saturday?" Of course. The days until Saturday seemed to crawl by. Lillian found herself distracted during lessons, wondering what Mason wanted to discuss that required the privacy of a ride away from town. By the time Saturday arrived, bringing with it a clear, cold day with the promise of snow in the air, her nerves were strung tight with anticipation. Mason arrived at the hotel early, leading a gentle mare that Lillian had ridden before alongside his own sturdy gelding. They rode out of town in companionable silence, following a trail that wound through the hills to the east. When they reached a sheltered clearing with a view of the distant mountains, Mason suggested they stop for a while. He spread a blanket on a fallen log for them to sit on, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a thermos of hot coffee, pouring some into 2 tin cups. "This spot is beautiful," Lillian said, looking out at the panorama before them. The mountains were already dusted with snow, their peaks gleaming white against the deep blue sky. "It's one of my favorites," Mason replied. "I found it during my first winter in Wyoming when I was still finding my way." He handed her a cup of coffee, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "Lillian, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." The seriousness in his tone made her heart race. "Yes." Mason set his own cup aside and took her free hand in both of his. "These past months have been the happiest I can remember. Getting to know you, seeing your strength and your kindness. The way you've embraced life here despite the challenges, it's made me realize what I've been missing all these years." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I know it might seem fast by Eastern standards, but out here, we tend to recognize what matters and hold on to it when we find it." He opened the box to reveal a simple but beautiful ring with a small diamond set in gold. "Lillian Matthews, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had half expected this moment, the reality of it still took her breath away. "Mason," she began, her voice catching with emotion. "Are you certain?" "With my condition, more certain than I've been about anything," he interrupted gently. "We'll build our family in whatever way feels right for us. There are children who need homes, young people who need guidance, and if it's just the two of us, that would be enough too." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had come to love. "All I know is that I want to face whatever comes next with you by my side." Tears of joy filled Lillian's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Mason Morgan, I will marry you." His smile could have outshone the sun as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and understanding. They were married 2 weeks before Christmas in the small church in Rock Springs, with James McAllister standing as Mason's best man and Margaret serving as Lillian's matron of honor. The entire town turned out for the celebration, filling the church to capacity and spilling out onto the street. Afterward, they held a reception at the hotel, where Mrs. Abernathy outdid herself with a feast that would be talked about for years to come. The schoolchildren presented their teacher and her new husband with a handmade quilt, each square representing something about the couple or the town. "Look at this one," Lillian said, pointing to a square that showed a crude representation of the schoolhouse. "And here's the Circle M brand." "And this," Mason said softly, his finger tracing a square that depicted 2 figures surrounded by smaller ones. "I believe represents our future family, however it comes to be." Christmas at the Circle M was everything Lillian could have hoped for. The main house was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, and a massive tree stood in the corner of the sitting room, adorned with handmade ornaments and candles. The ranch hands and their families gathered for a feast that featured 3 roast turkeys and more pies than Lillian could count. After dinner, as everyone relaxed with coffee or hot cider, James McAllister stood and called for attention. "As some of you know, Margaret and I are getting on in years," he began, his hand resting on his wife's shoulder. "We've been talking about taking a step back from the day-to-day running of the ranch. With Mason and Lillian now married, it seems like the perfect time to make that official." He raised his glass in a toast. "To Mason and Lillian Morgan, the new master and mistress of the Circle M Ranch. May your stewardship bring as much joy as ours has." Lillian looked at Mason in surprise. He hadn't mentioned this development to her, and from the expression on his face, it was equally unexpected news to him. "James," he began, clearly moved, "this is your home." "I never expected, and it remains our home," Margaret interjected firmly. "We're not going anywhere, but it's time for new energy and new ideas to shape the future of the Circle M. You've earned this, both of you." Later that night, as they lay in the bedroom that was now officially theirs, Lillian nestled against Mason's side. "Did you know they were planning this?" she asked softly. "Not at all," he admitted, his arm tightening around her. "James had mentioned retiring someday, but I thought that was still years away." "Are you happy about it?" Mason was silent for a moment, considering. "Yes," he said finally. "Not because I wanted to take over from James, but because it means they trust us with something they've built with their hearts and hands. It's a profound gift." Lillian thought about the path that had led her to this moment, the illness that had seemed like the end of her dreams, the journey west that had been born of desperation, the chance meeting with a kind cowboy who saw beyond her perceived limitations to the woman she truly was. "We'll honor their trust," she said, pressing a kiss to Mason's chest just above his heart. "And we'll build something worthy of it." Spring brought new life to the Circle M. Calves wobbled on spindly legs beside their mothers. Wildflowers dotted the hillsides with splashes of color, and Lillian found herself busier than ever, dividing her time between teaching at the schoolhouse in town and learning the intricacies of ranch management from Margaret. It was during a visit to one of the remote line shacks with Mason, checking on a cowhand who had been injured during branding, that they first met the children who would change their lives. The injured man, a widower named Anderson, had been caring for his 3 children alone since his wife's death 2 years earlier. The oldest, a girl of 10 named Emma, had been managing the household and looking after her brothers Peter, 8, and baby Michael, just turned 3, while their father worked. "I don't know what we're going to do," Anderson admitted to Mason as Lillian played with the children outside the small cabin. "Doc says I'll be laid up for at least 2 months with this leg. Can't work, can't take care of the little ones proper." Mason glanced out the window at his wife, who was helping Emma hang laundry while the boys clustered around her, clearly enchanted by the pretty lady who had brought them candy from town. "What if they stayed at the main house while you heal?" he suggested. "Lillian's school term ends next week, and she'll be at the ranch full-time for the summer. The children would be well cared for, and you could focus on getting back on your feet." Anderson's relief was palpable. "You do that. It's a lot to ask, even of a boss as good as you." "It's not asking," Mason replied firmly. "It's neighbors helping neighbors. That's how we survive out here." When Mason proposed the arrangement to Lillian on their ride back to the main house, her face lit with a joy that confirmed he had made the right suggestion. "Of course they must stay with us," she said immediately. "That poor man, trying to work and raise 3 children alone. And those children, Mason, they're wonderful, but they need more care than Emma can provide, capable as she is." The Anderson children arrived at the Circle M the following week, shy and uncertain at first, but quickly blossoming under Lillian's attentive care. Emma, released from the burden of being the household's primary caretaker, revealed herself to be a bright, curious girl with a talent for drawing. Peter, quiet and observant, became Mason's shadow, eager to learn everything about ranch operations. Little Michael, who had few memories of his mother, attached himself to Lillian with the unquestioning devotion of a child who had found a safe harbor after a storm. Summer passed in a blur of activity. Anderson's injury healed more slowly than anticipated, complicated by an infection that set his recovery back by weeks. As August approached and the new school term loomed, Lillian found herself increasingly anxious about the children's eventual departure. "I know they're not ours," she confessed to Mason one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Emma teach Peter a clapping game while Michael dozed in Lillian's lap. "But I've grown to love them as if they were." Mason reached over to take her hand, his expression thoughtful. "Anderson came to see me today," he said. "His leg's finally healing properly, but he's worried about the future. The line shack is no place for young children, especially with winter coming, and he can't work and care for them properly at the same time." Lillian's heart beat faster. "What did he say exactly?" he asked if I knew anyone who might want to take the children, all 3 of them, permanently. "He loves them, but he believes they deserve better than he can provide alone." Tears filled Lillian's eyes as she looked down at Michael's peaceful face, then across the yard at Emma and Peter. "Oh, Mason, could we? Is it even possible?" Mason squeezed her hand. I've already spoken to Judge Williams in town. With Anderson's consent, we could adopt them legally. Give them our name, raise them as our own. And Anderson, would he still see them? Of course. He'd remain on at the Circle M visit whenever he wishes. The children would know he's their father by birth, that he made a difficult choice out of love for them. Mason's voice was gentle but firm. This isn't about replacing him, Lillian. It's about giving these children the stable home and family they need. Lillian leaned her head against Mason's shoulder, overwhelmed with emotion. When I first told you I couldn't have children, I never imagined this possibility. 3 children, all at once. Mason chuckled, the sound rumbling beneath her ear. Life rarely gives us exactly what we expect, remember, but sometimes it gives us what we need in the most unexpected packages. The adoption was formalized in October, with Anderson present as a witness. The ceremony in Judge Williams' office was simple, but profound, officially making Emma, Peter, and Michael part of the Morgan family. Afterward, they celebrated at the Circle M with a party that included the entire ranch staff and many friends from town. As the guests departed, and the children were tucked into their beds in the rooms that had been redecorated specifically for each of them, Lillian found Mason standing at the window in their bedroom, looking out at the star-filled sky. "Happy?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a contentment she had never seen before. "More than I ever thought possible," he admitted, drawing her into his arms. "When I found you stranded by that stagecoach, I was just trying to help a lady in distress. I had no idea I was meeting the woman who would help me build the family I've always wanted." Lillian stretched up to kiss him, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had seen possibility where others might have seen limitation. "There are many ways to build a family," she whispered against his lips, echoing the words that had given her hope when she most needed it. "And this one is perfect." Mason's arms tightened around her. "Not perfect," he corrected gently. "Real, with challenges and adjustments ahead. But ours, Lillian. Completely ours." In the years that followed, the Morgan family grew in ways neither Lillian nor Mason could have predicted. 2 years after adopting the Anderson children, they took in twin girls whose parents had died in a flash flood. The year after that, a teenage boy who had been caught stealing from the general store came to work at the ranch as an alternative to jail, and eventually found a permanent place in their home and hearts. The Circle M became known throughout the territory as a place where children in need could find sanctuary, whether for a few weeks during a family crisis or permanently, when circumstances required. Lillian continued to teach at the schoolhouse in Rock Springs, her particular compassion for children facing difficulties, earning her the respect and admiration of the community. Mason, for his part, expanded the ranch operations to include not just cattle, but also a program that taught young men and women the skills needed for ranch work. Many who might otherwise have drifted into trouble found purpose and direction under his guidance. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat surrounded by their children now numbering 8 official adoptions and countless honorary family members who had passed through their lives, Lillian reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "If someone had told me the day I received that terrible diagnosis that it would eventually lead me to all this," she said, gesturing to the laughing, chattering family around them, "I would never have believed them." Mason took her hand, the gesture as familiar and comforting as it had been on the day he proposed. "Sometimes the greatest blessings come from our deepest disappointments," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "And sometimes a family built from choice rather than chance is the strongest kind of all." Lillian looked around at the children who called them mother and father, each with their own story, their own path to the circle M, and knew with absolute certainty that Mason was right. The family they had built together, piece by precious piece, was more extraordinary than anything she could have imagined in her youth. "I love you, Mason Morgan," she said, leaning against his shoulder. "Thank you for showing me that there are, indeed, many ways to build a family." "And I love you," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple, "for having the courage to build this one with me, one child at a time." As the celebration continued around them, Lillian thought of that frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Rock Springs, believing her dreams of family were forever beyond reach. How wrong she had been, and how grateful she was for that mistake. For in losing one dream, she had found another richer, more complex, and infinitely more rewarding than she could ever have imagined.